Two candidates with competing visions for America, one of which in particular is making Europe nervous again.
We are committed to pursue global engagement, to uphold international rules and norms, to defend democratic values at home and abroad, and to work with our allies and partners in pursuit of shared goals.
After years of building up foreign nations, defending foreign borders, and protecting foreign lands, we are finally going to build up our country, defend our borders, and protect our citizens. It's called America First, and it's going to happen at levels never seen before.
And it's those levels that are making Europe anxious. But Europe has seen this before, but this time it is happening at a time of a changing world order and changing US priorities. So is Europe better prepared to deal with it this time round? I'm Biresh, Banerjee, and we look forward to your questions and comments on this today on Newsdesk.
And I'm Pablo, Foley, Elias. There is plenty for us to analyse. So keep your comments and questions coming in. And we've already had some. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. We have one here from Spike Mans, Triple S. Instead of looking to the US, maybe Europe should make itself as strong as possible and work together closer on all domains. We also have another comment saying that they like, referring to, we can assume it's Europe, like having their defence subsidised by the US taxpayer. And then we have another comment here where Europe needs to worry about themselves. They can't even produce arms to protect themselves and think they can fight with, quote, spiritual warfare. Their weak governments would be rolled over in a few days if it wasn't for the United States. We keep Europe protected, but do they do anything for us but complain?
Ooh.
So pretty strong.
Pretty strong. There's a bit of hyperbole there. I mean, in terms of at least protecting Europe and producing weapons, Europe does have weapons manufacturers that produce weapons, not just for Europe, but for around the world. But then again, we can address all of that. So keep those comments coming in. That's just a sample of comments while you consider what to send us. It's just time to introduce you all to the people sat at the desk today on this episode of Newsdesk. Jared Reed, seasoned Newsdesk hand, is going to be providing us some context on this transatlantic relationship. Why, in fact, is the US-EU relationship so consequential? Jared, thank you for doing that. That's going to be later. Cherie Chan is again with us. She's going to be with you guys in the chat, taking care of your questions and responding to you as well. Someone you will not be seeing, but the one who is making this show possible is Wade Adams. We need to mention Wade because he sat there with
the great Wade.
The great Wade wades through all the troubles and gets this done.
All of us.
A gift to all of us, sitting with our technical crew, making all of this happen. And later in the program, we'll be talking to two very special correspondents. One of them is, in fact, a bureau chief, Alexandra von Nahmen, our Brussels bureau chief.
That's right.
And we'll also be speaking to Nick Connolly, whom most of you all would have seen a number of times reporting out of Ukraine, our Kyiv correspondent, Nick Connolly, for his perspective on things.
So as we've been saying, plenty of comments already. Do please come right into us with your questions and comments. Cherie's keeping an eye on it, and of course we'll put those to our guests as well. And Cherie, actually, we have, of course, a poll, as we always do. So tell us, what's in the poll this week?
Today, our poll question is, where will the US election impact Europe most? There are 4 options: the NATO alliance, trade policies, assistance to Ukraine, or diplomatic relations. Remember to vote, and we will talk about the result later in our discussion.
Remember, we are trying to sort of get a handle on how the US election will impact Europe, and it has to be seen beyond the context of just one particular candidate. I think we know which candidate we are talking about. That having been said, let's dive right in and head over to Jared, who is going to provide us on some context on the US-EU relationship.
Yeah, I'm going to contextualize, I guess, why this relationship is so important today. And I'm going to start off with a bit of a history lesson. It's not to bore you all, but it's to talk about some really important facts that hopefully will crystallize a little bit what we're talking about today. So if we go back to just after the Second World War ended, the devastation here in Europe meant that there was a strong need for cooperation to ensure peace and stability. The US out of this emerged as a superpower as European countries were rebuilding themselves and recovering themselves, which led to the establishment of various treaties and organisations that we know today that highlight this cooperation after the Second World War, like the UN, for example, which was founded in 1945. The US and many European countries are founding members of that. The International Monetary Fund, part of the reasons that was set up was to help mend and reconstruct the international economy after the Second World War. The Council of Europe, which promotes democracy, human rights and rule of law. Here in Europe, the US supports many of these initiatives. And another one of these organisations, the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, that focuses on economic policy coordination among member countries, which are the US and various ones from the EU. So we have this historical context. We look a bit more towards today. A big part of the relationship between the US and Europe is about security, and that is through the world's most important military and security alliance, NATO. There are 32 members of NATO today. I'm going to show you where they are on a map from the NATO website. So if Wade can bring that up. So here is how things look when we're not highlighting who the NATO members are. And here you can see in this kind of light blue who today's 32 NATO member states are. As we can see, the US is the largest member of NATO, the leading member of the alliance. That means there's a huge dependency on the US to provide security and defence if it's needed. That means its participation in NATO is critical. We can also see that there are a number of EU member countries, most recently Sweden and Finland, who joined after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Aside from that, the US and EU have an extensive security cooperation, like intelligence sharing, for example. We can also move on to trade. The US and EU are two of the largest economies in the world. They have the world's largest bilateral trade and investment relationship. That accounts for a really significant chunk of the global GDP. And I'm going to bring up, if I can get rid of the NATO slide, I'm going to bring you up some stats here that have come from the EU. So there are 4 billion euros in goods and services that cross the Atlantic daily. This is, in 2022, accounted for $1.5 trillion in trade in goods and services, or 42% of global GDP. As I say, this has various links not only on trade, but flow-on effects on other things like regulatory standards in industries like tech and agriculture and finance, and cooperation in innovation in research and science and health and various things like that. But this is an important relationship, as I've outlined here. But as we know, relationships can go through good times and they can also go through some tricky times. And as we know, there was a shock to the system here in Europe when Donald Trump became US president back in 2016. He ended up slapping tariffs on steel and aluminium coming from the EU, which was an unusual move because, as we've established, the EU is an ally and he still did that. These tariffs have been paused under US President Joe Biden. We also know Donald Trump's been very critical of NATO. He's at one point, or a number of points, threatened to leave NATO in order to force allies to increase their defence spending. So all of these concerns led German Chancellor, the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel, to say this back in 2017. Let's take a listen.
The times in which we can fully count on others are somewhat over, as I have experienced in the past few days. And that is why I can only say, we Europeans must really take our destiny into our own hands.
So the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel there, it feels quite a long time ago that Merkel was Chancellor now, doesn't it? So much has happened. Things do look quite different to how they were back then. Security has really become the key concern in Europe right now because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And countries have reacted by sharply increasing their defence spending and getting off the snooze button, as the German foreign minister, the German defence minister put it. If Donald Trump wins the US election next week, even if he doesn't pull out of NATO, there are still a lot of questions about what his plans are or could be and how they will impact how things look here in Europe.
Thanks for that, Jared.
Yeah, and there's plenty of comments coming in already. I just want to jump in with a couple. With regards to NATO and security, we have a comment here from Rusty Shackelford who says, is the EU scared that they'll finally have to actually defend themselves and instead of having the US fight for them? So similar to what we were hearing before, time to cut back on the social programmes and defend yourselves. Another one on the war in Ukraine, Karolina Bijena. Ukraine should be worried regardless of the newly elected US president. Be interesting to see what Nick has to say as well on that one. And then also just a lot of comments coming in with regards to the issue of security and NATO and, of course, the war in Ukraine. So do keep your comments coming in and your questions, and we'll put them to our guests today.
And it's good that you're sending in those comments when it comes to security and NATO, because this is something that we will be discussing. Just be patient with us. There's a lot to get through. Let's bring in somebody who has quite a handle on all of these issues, and that is Alexandra von Nahmen, our Brussels bureau chief, who's been able to make the time in a very busy week just ahead of the US elections. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us. I will come to you in a moment, but just for the benefit of the guys who are tuning in and watching this on YouTube, we've prepared a collage of sorts of sound bites from various European leaders and European figures with their views on the US election as we head up to voting day. Let's just listen to that first, and then we'll come to you and chat.
It's the people in America who have the right to choose their president.
No matter what will happen in the US, Europe has to be able to do more on our own and in cooperation with our allies.
We trust on the Euro-Atlantic alliance and the Euro-Atlantic solidarity and friendship. But besides that, we have to do more.
I don't have a vote, but whoever comes out of that election, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, I'm absolutely convinced that collectively we can work together.
What we will do, we will open several battle of champagne if Trump is back. But what the others will do, that's another question.
Some reactions there, Alexandra. Is that the kind of a vibe you've been getting across European capitals? Because you've been talking to quite a few people there.
Yes, sure. And we have to say that most of them are really worried about a potential second Trump presidency, because they understand, knowing what he did during his first term in office, that a potential second Trump presidency would be very disruptive with regards to the US-EU relationship. And then again, of course, they would be very relieved to see Kamala Harris win the race to the White House, although we, of course, have to say that all of them are saying, we don't have a say in this election. It's up to the American people to decide who is their next president. But of course, they understand there is a lot at stake, whether it comes to trade or security, and security being now one of the most important issues for the Europeans, with Russia's war on Ukraine still going on.
And we do intend to talk about security, but just in terms of candidate Trump, I mean, yes, one can understand that there is a lot of anxiety in Europe when it comes to Donald Trump. But then hasn't the tide turned a bit since 2016? I mean, we are in a somewhat of an emerging multipolar world. Do you not get the sense that maybe Europe is also trying to find its own feet? And do you think there is a move to try and foolproof its relationship with the United States, irrespective of who occupies the White House? Do you see any movement towards that?
Well, of course, and it started with the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who was calling on all the members of the European Union to be more independent, to not rely on the US. We heard the thought from the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So there is this growing understanding that, of course, the Europeans have to take responsibility and to invest more in their own defense, that they need to be more independent and not rely on the US regardless of who is then sitting in the White House. But the problem, of course, is that this is quite a new movement, a new development in the European Union, in Europe in general, and it's just gonna take time to be able to produce enough weapons, to be able to invest more on defense spending, and that is also what the Europeans understand, that even though there is this growing effort to do more, it will take time, and that is why actually at the moment there is no alternative for the Europeans to have a strong and good relationship with their biggest ally and the biggest partner, the United States, especially when we have a look at what is going on in the world, when we see the tensions in the Indo-Pacific, or the practices that China is introducing when it comes to trade and other issues. So all people are saying it is important to have a very good relationship with the US. However, and with the small collage that you introduced, we also heard from Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister. There are leaders within the European Union who say we want to see Trump return to the White House, because when we talk about what they think, how the world should function, what they consider the fight against woke ideologies and liberal democracies, they want to team up with Trump to fight against what they see as something that they don't want to see anymore in Europe.
I'm glad you brought up Viktor Orban, because I did want to come to Viktor Orban. He does want to drink a glass of champagne with Donald Trump, should Donald Trump win this. But how big is the worry in European capitals that a victory for Donald Trump would potentially embolden populists such as Viktor Orban? I think most of Europe looks at Viktor Orban as a populist in that measure. So how big is that worry that populists like him might be emboldened if Donald Trump were to win?
It's very big. I mean, we have to understand that the European Union is a bloc that stands for certain values, the rule of law, human rights, democracy. And that is something that, to be honest, we have to say Viktor Orban doesn't care so much about, even though he may act in a different way publicly. So many lawmakers that we have been speaking with in the European Parliament told us that they are really afraid that, worried that Viktor Orban and other populists could feel emboldened and encouraged by potential victory of Donald Trump in the US. And those populists, they want to change the European Union, to be disruptive from within the bloc. And of course, that could have a huge impact on the way how we live in the European Union, how all the members work together, because all of them on many issues have to be on the same page. All the 27 member states have to agree on important issues to advance the union. And if they don't, if they have a Viktor Orban or other populists among them emboldened by a potential Trump victory, they will not be able to agree.
Pardon me for playing devil's advocate here, Alexandra. I mean, I don't know if you're giving too much credit, if that's the right word, to Donald Trump for encouraging populist tendencies on the European continent, because we had the European elections in June, wasn't it? And we had, I think, about far-right parties winning some 25% of the vote. I mean, that was the main top story, the top headline that emerged from these elections. So you already have Europe, which seems to be on a particular course. And this is before the election campaign in the US really kicked off in earnest as it has now.
Sure, but I'm not saying that it started with Donald Trump, even though we have to say that many things that we are seeing in the US, they happened there, and then they may happen in Europe as well. But of course, the whole new thing, the new development with people, more and more people voting for the far right or being attracted to populist movement, it has not started with Donald Trump. Actually, members of his MAGA movement look to Hungary as a role model because Viktor Orban there was able to bring the media under his control, the courts, and to change the constitution there. So, of course, we see what is happening in the European Union. It has not started in the US. And still, I would say that for those populists here in Europe, when they compare themselves with what is going on in the US, if there is a Donald Trump victory next week, they would assume that, you know, they're on the right track, that they would have a supporter in him, and that they wouldn't need to take into account what others in Europe are saying. So that, I guess, was my point here.
Alexandra, it's Pablo here. I'm the co-host today. Good to see you.
Hi, Pablo.
What I find very interesting about the issue of populism in Europe, and we're discussing it, obviously we've been focusing on Viktor Orban, is that, you know, we've seen this growth, as Biresh was talking about the European elections, and we've been talking about, but of course it's not this one bloc. It's quite an interesting sort of mixture depending on the countries, and they have different ways of viewing the future of Europe. How do you see that sort of developing in the coming years? Do you see that there'll be more of an alignment in that sense, or that there'll continue to be these divisions?
Well, it really depends. I think at the moment we have to say that we see deepening divisions within the European Union. And the reasons for that may differ from member state to member state, but I think many people feel overwhelmed with what is going on. We have the question about, you know, social justice and small crises like the housing crisis in many member states of the European Union. So people do not feel that they are as good off as their parents were, maybe. And there is, of course, Russia's war raging on Europe's doorsteps. We have an energy crisis. We have to deal with inflation. And all of that, I think, is fueling populist movements in the European Union. And of course, it will be up to the leaders of the EU to address the concerns of their citizens. At the moment, it seems that they are not doing enough. The democratic elected leaders in the EU are not doing enough to address those issues. And that is why I would say we see in some member states, Slovakia, Hungary, of course, but also in Sweden, in the Netherlands, just not so far away from where I am sitting in Brussels, in Belgium, populist parties making gains, not only in the European election, but also in national elections. So I think that the European Union, as well as the US, they are facing big challenges ahead, and the jury is still out what the result will be in the end.
And I'd like to move on to another aspect that we did want to discuss with you, Alexandra, and that is trade, because earlier Jared explained to all you guys in the watching the stream that the trade between the European Union and the United States, I think it's the largest trade relationship in the world, right? Like,
that's right.
Looking at something like, as per 2022 figures, 1.3 trillion, or was it 1.5 trillion?
It was $1.5 trillion. And yeah.
And that's the kind of relationship we are talking about. And the question really is, I wonder, Alexandra, is there fear in Europe that this $1.5 trillion worth of trade... Euros. That's the difference. $1.3 trillion, $1.5 trillion euros. Yeah. It's a big number. It's a big number. More than 1 trillion euros we can agree on. Yeah. Sorry, Alexandra. Is there a fear in Europe that this trade relationship might be dented depending on who wins the election next week?
Yes, and to demonstrate how big the fears are, you have to understand that there is even a special task force, the so-called Trump task force, that has been established ahead of the US election. So the EU Commission, this is the executive body in the European Union, they are getting ready for any scenario, and they are thinking about what they would need to do if Trump is elected, and if he is really pushing through with his threat to introduce tariffs on all foreign imported goods that are arriving in the US. they want, I guess, we can assume that if that is going to happen, to retaliate. And that, of course, means then a trade war. So quite grim scenario that we may be seeing there.
My main takeaway from what you said there was there's something called a Trump task force that's working in Europe.
Trump task force.
Is that really what it's called, a Trump task force? I mean, is that abbreviated as a TTF? Sorry, I'm making.
Well, it might.
Go ahead.
It may not be an official name.
Oh, right. Okay.
But that is how it is being known here among journalists. I don't know whether they call it really the Trump force, a Trump task force, but that is its nickname, I would say.
Fantastic.
We've got loads of comments actually coming in. I'll just put those to you as well, Alexandra. With regards to this issue of trade and Donald Trump, we have one here from Harry Namkung who says Trump will put tariffs on everything. And then with the issue as well of Trump possibly being re-elected, he said, we have DeVos saying Trump will embolden far-right authoritarian movements. So, you know, plenty of comments coming in on both those topics.
You know, we're talking about tariffs. Let's just listen to what Donald Trump has had to say about tariffs, because he says it with a particular tone and particular tenor. Let's just listen to what he has had to say on tariffs, and then we can keep talking.
And I say the most beautiful word in the entire dictionary of words is the word tariff. I love tariff. I can make anybody do anything through the use of tariffs. I can keep people out of war. I can keep us out of war. The word tariff is the most beautiful.
Who would have thought that the word tariff is the most beautiful? I'm sure Europe doesn't share that same view. I'd wager to say that. But you know, we're talking about Donald Trump. But, you know, when it comes to tariffs, I remember in 2016, when Donald Trump took over during that presidency, he imposed tariffs on European aluminium and steel. And then the EU responded in kind with tariffs on Harley-Davidsons. I think they were on whiskey as well, or liquor and stuff like that. But correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra, those tariffs haven't really been withdrawn. They've just been suspended by the administration that came thereafter, that is Joe Biden's administration. I mean, does that tell us something about the thinking in America when it comes to protecting American industries and workers, that it's America first when it comes to trade, and Europe may have to suffer the cost of that?
Well, for sure. And that is why people here, officials and bureaucrats, and of course lawmakers that we've been speaking with, say, of course, Europe needs to retaliate if there will be new tariffs. But as you said, the tariffs imposed by Trump during his first term in office, they are kind of still in place, even though they are suspended. So there is a growing isolationist movement or policies, regardless whether you talk about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And lawmakers here understand that while Kamala Harris, if elected, would be probably more pragmatically looking at things, and maybe they hope she will understand that tariffs in the first place hurt U.S. consumers. So they hope to have a better understanding with her, but still the trade deficit that the U.S. has with the European Union is an issue, has been an issue, and of course has to be addressed in some ways. But the question is how it can be addressed and who they will be speaking with after the election in the U.S. I just wanted to tell you one story. At that time, I was based in the U.S., and I remember when Trump met with the then EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, and they were on the brink of a real trade war between the U.S. and the European Union. And Trump was threatening to impose even more tariffs, and the EU was willing and determined determined to retaliate even more. But Juncker understood that, and instead of escalating, he just promised Trump to export more soybeans, even though he was not in charge of deciding such an issue. And then that was actually what Trump wanted to hear, and they were able to agree somehow, and the trade war was averted. So I think there are some here in the European Union who still think and hope that if elected again, Trump will be kind of willing to negotiate a deal that would make him look good.
Is there a list of an unofficial list, I'd imagine, in Europe of Trump whisperers who can talk to Donald Trump and get things done? Because Mark Rutte is one of those who's been called a Trump whisperer. Now he's a NATO chief.
NATO chief, yeah.
But maybe you don't have to reveal those names, Alexandra. I was just wondering if there is an unofficial list somewhere. Right.
Well, we, of course, have a list.
All right.
With Mark Rutte on top of it.
All right. Speaking of Mark Rutte, we do want to talk about NATO and European security. But before we do that, I wonder if the time is ripe to have a look at what the chat has been doing.
That's right, yeah.
Should we do that with Cherie?
Yeah, I mean, as Pablo already is paying attention to the chat, there are quite a lot of people expressing their opinions about this election and about our topic as well. Someone whose name is Spikeman, I hope I pronounce it properly. This person said, instead of looking to the US, maybe Europe should make itself as strong as possible and work together closer on all domains. Invest in innovations and a global position for the near future. And there is also someone expressing opinions on the election. Last man said democracy is failing miserably in the US. So quite a lot of opinions about this topic.
I think we're not hearing these for the first time. There have been opinions like that. I mean, you're on our US election team, and you've been encountering these in the past few months, haven't you?
Absolutely. There's plenty of... we're keeping, obviously, a close eye on it at the moment with regards as well to NATO as well. We've seen a few comments of people asking questions such as, how will the NATO map change going forward? There was even a question there from one of our viewers who is asking, will an Asian country be allowed into NATO as well? So we have a lot of these questions being put forward.
We are talking about NATO. Let's just dive right in to NATO and the question of European security, which seems to be the cornerstone of a number of questions that are being raised. Alexandra, does Europe really believe that if Donald Trump were to become president, the US could potentially withdraw from NATO or lessen its involvement? Is that a real risk?
I think that the question of how deep and how massive the US will be involved in NATO is a big one. I don't think that at least officials at NATO headquarters that we've been talking to, they believe that the US understands, regardless of who is in the White House, that they need NATO, that there is a value to alliances to the US. But the worry is that Trump, if elected again, could decide to just do less, to withdraw forces or generals from NATO command, or to withdraw troops from Europe, or to just do less, or, which is a psychological thing, to repeat again and again that he is not going to defend allies who are not spending more than 2% on defense. Because the whole thing about NATO is the promise that if one ally is attacked, that the others will come to their defense. And if you put it into question, that of course, what sense does it make to be member of such an alliance? And that's a big issue here, I think, the biggest maybe.
I think this is just the right time to segue into reminding people what Donald Trump said. I think this was in February at a rally, I forget where Donald Trump described his exchange with an unnamed leader, European leader, on the question of NATO. Let's just listen to that soundbite and then we'll talk after that.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
This has been an old demand, and it's not new to Donald Trump. Even under the Obama administration, there were demands from the U.S. administration for allies to try and increase their spending. And in fact, if I'm not wrong, Alexandra, you'll know better, but this is the year that at least 23 of 32 NATO countries are going to hit that 2% of GDP spending on defense target, including countries like Germany, which had earlier much lesser contributions. Something like that was already announced earlier this year, but still you have Donald Trump carrying on with this rant of pay up or we won't defend you. What does that say about, I don't know, European efforts to communicate that to Donald Trump?
Well, I would say that it shows you that they not have been very successful, apparently, even though we have seen a couple of delegations travel to the U.S. to talk to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, to even meet with Trump and to explain to him the value of NATO to the U.S. and the fact that, and praising him for pushing allies towards spending more. And actually it was quite interesting that Mark Rutte, we already spoke about the new head of the alliance, that he, during his very first press conference, praised Trump for, as I said, pushing allies towards spending more on defense. He said that what Trump had said about China, it's now a common understanding among allies, and China is now seen as a systematic challenge to the alliance. So Rutte praised Trump a lot, and we sitting there and asking our questions and listening to Rutte, we were quite surprised that he was so outspoken about that he used to work together with Trump, that he can work with whoever is in the White House. But of course, that is also part of Rutte's strategy to be ready for a potential second Trump presidency and be capable of making sure that Trump is not going to withdraw from NATO or is not going to weaken the alliance that is so important for the Europeans.
So it seems to be the case that flattery gets you far with Donald Trump. We'll see if that actually comes to pass next week onwards. But I just did want to ask you, we keep talking about Donald Trump, but even under the Biden administration, and this is something that happened under Trump as well, the U.S. has been shifting its focus to the Indo-Pacific, particularly China as its main rival. And then there are schools of thought that say, well, the U.S. is going to be so preoccupied with the Indo-Pacific and particularly trying to contain China that maybe it will not be able to concentrate on Europe in the same way. Either way, whatever happens, Europe needs to be self-sufficient, doesn't it? And I wonder if there are any plans afoot for Europe to be able to do that within the boundaries of NATO, for example.
Well, there are plans, and that means that they are hoping to spend more on defense, that they are planning to spend more on defense, that there are efforts to ramp up weapons production in Europe, that there are plans among some members of the alliance and of the European Union to team up to produce more weapons, to produce more artillery shells, to also strengthen then their industrial base. But as I said, I think at the beginning of our conversation, it's going to take time. And at the moment, we really have to say that the Europeans, they need the US. They cannot not rely on the US at the moment for their own defense. So this is a big dilemma, I would say, also when we look what's happening in Ukraine and how much military aid was provided by the Americans and how much was provided by the Europeans. And how they understand that without the US military aid for Ukraine, Kyiv probably is not going to continue to fight on the battlefield the way how they do right now, even though even now they of course need more weapons, more air defense systems and more artillery.
Alexandra, is it fair to sum up and say something like along the lines of, if Donald Trump were to become president, it would be like putting European heads in a bucket of cold water, the shock treatment 2.0. But when it comes to Kamala Harris, Europe gets a bit more breathing room to try and put its plans into action so that it is not so reliant on the US. Would that be a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, it may be. And the tone will be much friendlier, even though, as you mentioned before, if Kamala Harris is elected, she will also focus more on the Indo-Pacific. So the Europeans have to do more for their own defense, for sure.
Alexandra, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us and making the time. We know you're extremely busy, so we appreciate these 40 minutes that you've been able to spare for us. Thanks so much, Alexandra. And
thanks,
speak
Alexandra.
To you soon.
Good to speak to you.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye, Alexandra.
Very interesting, by the way, what the comments have been saying coming in with regards to what Alexandra said. We have one here from Lastman who says Europe has a robust military-industrial complex, just needs to ramp up production, which is what Alexandra was saying, and more investment in research and development and integration across European nations. The French and British own atomic weapons. So, you know, there's a lot of comments coming in with regards to just basically that Europe needs to ramp up.
Yeah. But that's the thing about ramping up. I mean, this is something that it became
clear.
It sounds simple, but it's not.
But it's not.
You cannot do it within, say, 24 hours, but it takes a longer time. And I think the thing over here is to do with the amount of investment that you require to actually have, say, I don't know, a production line that produces 155 mm, I don't know, howitzer shells, for example. Right. It takes a lot of money to sort of, you invest a lot of money in that, and you cannot invest it only for, say, 6 months. No. You invest in it, and then you want to produce those many shells. Right. The challenge, I think, in Europe has always been that that demand has not been so high, but now it's a different thing.
Completely different. Plus, let's not forget that a lot of countries also are having issues with actually getting people to work. We have, you know, a deficit of workers in a lot of countries. Here in Germany, for example,
a deficit of soldiers in some countries.
You know,
like
absolutely. It was pretty interesting what Alexandra had to say there, and of course with regards to NATO expansion as well. When with this comment before about asking about Asian expansion, of course, let's not forget that Turkey straddles both Europe and Asia, of course.
But then there are Indo-Pacific partners like South Korea, Australia, and I think Japan also, which keep regularly getting invited to NATO conferences, and they are continuously in dialogue. They're not members.
They're not members.
They're not members.
Exactly.
But it's not that NATO is not reaching out to Indo-Pacific.
They're friends.
They're friends.
Close friends.
And it's important.
Sure.
And we're already seeing North Korean troops potentially in Russia. And that brings us...
Confirmed. Yeah, anyway.
That was confirmed. And that brings us to Ukraine and to DW correspondent, Kyiv correspondent, Nick Connolly, who's been patiently waiting and listening to everything. Nick, thank you so much for your patience. There's a lot to talk to you about. Let's just, before we start asking you questions and throwing things your way, let's just listen to what both candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, have said on Ukraine and particularly Russia. Let's just listen to that collage and montage that we've prepared, and then we'll come back to you and talk.
Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine, and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out.
If Donald Trump were president, Vladimir Putin will be sitting in Kyiv.
This is a war that has to end, and we're going to get that war ended. I'm going to try, and I think I can, get it ended as president-elect. In other words, before I even take over the White House.
We understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence.
I think Zelensky is one of the greatest salesmen I've ever seen. Every time he comes in, we give him $100 billion. But he should never have let that war start. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it resolved.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have, oh, I see.
What you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
Strong views there from both candidates. Nick, How are Ukrainians viewing this election? With trepidation, with some other feelings?
There's obviously a lot of fear about all these different scenarios, and particularly the talk from Trump there of ending the war in 24 hours, which for most people here sounds a lot like code for basically forcing Ukraine to capitulation, pulling the plug on US support. Lots of people, on the other hand, you speak to here say, well, we don't get a vote in this, so we might as well just, basically focus on ourselves till the election happens and then deal with what happens. But you saw from that kind of slightly painful scene there of Zelensky and Trump standing together in America, in Washington recently, where you had Trump basically saying, I've got good relations with Ukraine, but I've also got good relations with Putin. And then Zelensky basically kind of stops him, interrupts him and says, I hope you have better relations with us. And all Trump basically could give was a kind of slightly kind of sheepish grin to that. So there is real worry, but Ukrainians have been through potentially more dangerous situations. So there is kind of a bit of hope they can still talk him round and make it clear to Trump what's at stake also for his prestige if he basically sells them down the river.
But President Zelensky was in the United States presenting his so-called victory plan to the Biden administration. I mean, that didn't seem to have been received with great warmth. Is there something that the Ukrainians aren't doing right to convince just the current administration that they are a worthy bet?
I think we're not at a stage yet. You don't get a sense that the current kind of democratic thinking is that Ukraine isn't a worthy bet, but they maybe weren't kind of impressed by his victory plan, didn't see it as something that was kind of qualitatively new. I think it's also a bit a question of kind of expectation management. By calling it a victory plan or kind of plan to end the war, it suggests that basically there were obvious things that you just weren't doing for the last 2.5 years, and that suddenly you're just going to come up with some genius idea that will make everything better. I think that just isn't possible, right? Basically what he was asking for was long-range weapons, something he's been talking about asking for ages, and it's just a bigger kind of set of talking points. I think calling it a plan was unhelpful for his kind of cause, and there is a kind of bigger issue where the Ukrainians see the people around Biden and the people they expect to be around Harris as too conservative, as too worried about escalation, and they say basically by not giving us the weapons to really make this war painful for Putin, you're just dragging this out. You're stopping us from collapsing, you're giving us enough to keep going, but you're not giving us enough to really make it painful for the Russians.
Part of this victory plan, because we are talking about it, President Zelensky talked about receiving an invitation, inviting Ukraine to join NATO and ultimately the EU somewhere down the line. That's part of his victory plan that he's presented. Since we are talking about transatlantic relationships, is this at all a real possibility if there is tensions in this transatlantic relationship?
Look, I think, these kind of tensions are not new and they will never go away. I think that is on itself not, something that is a deal breaker. In this kind of situation where Ukraine is so dependent, obviously it's a very difficult relationship for someone like Zelensky to kind of constantly be the one having to ask for help, having to ask for more. But we have seen that, even though initially, for instance, his requests for American F-16 fighter jets were basically, cast away, cast off, poo-pooed as kind of unrealistic, eventually he got there. So there is a dynamic where he basically has to kind of rub people up the wrong way, be told that he's asking for the impossible, and then eventually, maybe 6 months or a year down the line, the things he wants happen.
I mean, ultimately, when we're talking about American support for Ukraine, we're talking about lots of money, lots of these military packages, and lots of weapons and heavy weapons and F-16s, for example. Is there a thinking in Ukraine that Ukraine can sustain itself without American support? Is there a way in which Ukraine can potentially do that?
I think maybe not fully on its own. I mean, there definitely is contingency planning for having to rely on Europe more, and a Trump administration maybe initially just kind of turning the taps off, and then they're having to spend a bit of time trying to convince other Republicans to weigh in and try and get Trump to change his mind. But there is also the question of Russian assets. There are hundreds of billions of euros or dollars of Russian assets that were frozen in Western banks that so far have only been frozen and not confiscated. And that's something that Ukraine really wants to get access to. I was speaking recently to a Ukrainian member of parliament. She's the head of a Liberal party in the parliament here, Kira Rudik, about that. Let's have a listen to what she had to say on that.
Why should American people be paying to support Ukraine? And the good answer is they should not. Because right now, there are $500 billion of Russian money that is being stored in the democratic countries. But the next step would be actually to go further and unfreeze the assets and use them for the sake of our victory. And that will require $0, £0, €0 from the budgets of the countries that support us.
That sounds utterly reasonable. Nick, what's against this plan?
So basically, it's just been fear on the part of Western policymakers that this could damage the reputation, basically, of the European and American banking systems, that people from other regions of the world who previously parked their money in Europe, in the United States, might think that in the future these kinds of sanctions, confiscations would hurt them and take their money to the Emirates, say, to Singapore, to other banking hubs. But it is extraordinary that now, 2.5 years in, Western policymakers are more scared about kind of thinking about that than they are about asking their taxpayers to pay tens, if not hundreds of billions of euros towards helping Ukraine when this money is there. So I think that there's really going to be a push. We've heard from several European countries, France particularly, even Germany, that they are unable to continue the level of financing that we've seen in recent years. They're going to have to reduce the budget kind of allocations to Ukrainian defence, and this is the obvious kind of alternative.
If this alternative isn't something that is implemented, any other ideas that the Ukrainians have?
Well, right now, what's happening in terms of these Russian assets, they're frozen and the interest is being used. It's often being used to pay off then. So Western countries are taking loans that are going to be, the money is going to be given to Ukraine, and those loans are going to be paid off with the interest payments rather than the capital that is just frozen but hasn't been confiscated. So there is that. That is a lesser sum, obviously, than a full confiscation. And Ukraine is trying to produce more weapons here domestically. So we're seeing, whereas at the beginning of the war, we'd have Western countries ordering very expensive weapons from their own home countries' factories. And obviously right now, at a time when countries around the world are rebuilding their armies, the prices have skyrocketed. They're now sending money to Ukraine to build weapons in Ukraine, which obviously helps the economy here, creates jobs, but also is able to produce weapons at much lower prices than they would be able to achieve at a German or an American plant.
What are Ukrainian expectations of Europe in a scenario that post next week, post election results next week, assuming we get election results on time, what are Ukrainian expectations of Europe? Do they think that Europe will be able to shoulder any burden that the US potentially cannot?
It's obviously the hope, and Ukrainians, are constantly reminding Europeans that it is cheaper and easier to let Ukrainians fight and to support Ukraine's army to hold up the Russian army rather than to do it themselves. They say, look at the Baltics. Baltic states are very worried, are rebuilding their armies. Do you really want to risk a kind of resurgent Russia trying to basically undo the kind of post-1990 consensus, the post-1990 kind of framework of European security? Do you really want to take that risk? So they're obviously hoping that Europe gets its act together. Some of it is also about coordination, right? At the first year or two of the war, you had lots of chaos, each country doing its own thing, often replicating stuff, countries trying to outbid themselves to buy supplies, the same supplies to send to Ukraine. And now you're seeing multiple countries working together to supply Ukraine with spare parts, with tanks. And so there is a sense that more can be achieved with less money, given that there's a bit of coordination, there's a bit of experience. And Ukraine can also say, we don't want those systems. We currently, the Ukrainians talk about a zoo of different technology, whereas most countries have one type of tank. Ukraine has several, the same with all kinds of military hardware. So by now, establishing what actually works in real life conditions and what is available on the market, they can actually kind of streamline all this support and try and get a better result, with a smaller price tag.
It's interesting looking at here at the comments. Hey, Nick, it's Pablo here. Just seeing people talk about this issue of how the US may proceed depending on who comes into office after next week's election. And with regards to, we have one question, which is an interesting one. I'm not sure Donald Trump has actually said this directly, but it says, Nick, do you support Trump's idea to end the war through dialogue? I'm not sure Donald Trump said dialogue. I don't think he said that, but it's an interesting question, all the least. And then there's a lot of talk here about the US sort of being sick and tired of being, quote, the world police. And this is sort of a part of it, I suppose, not helping Ukraine the way it has up until this point, and that Europe also should be grateful that they've not been dragged into the war as well. So going back to that question about dialogue, how do Ukrainians, I'm curious to know, how do they see an end to this war? What's sort of being discussed as the way for this to stop? Is there, is dialogue within the realm of possibilities for Ukrainians?
I don't think dialogue seems very realistic seen from here. There aren't kind of signals coming out of Moscow to that effect that show kind of serious intent to speak, right? This is, a Russian leadership that still talks about basically Ukraine being a kind of misunderstanding of history, a kind of fake country, talking about denazification, demilitarization, basically telling Ukrainians that they need to be basically without any protection to be acceptable to Moscow. Those things have been repeated since the start up till recently. I think the kind of Ukrainian perspective on this is that basically Ukraine needs to make this more painful for Russia in terms of attacking, Russian infrastructure beyond Russia's border, deep inside the Russian territory by, more economic pressure. We're seeing those attacks on Russia's oil facilities, its oil refineries, its export capacity. So, they don't see a kind of good way out of this. They can only see a way that maybe if Russia really starts feeling the pain, and we have seen that Russia is struggling now to recruit enough people that, financially, its reserves are used up. Yes, it is getting around sanctions, but it is costing Russia dear. That, Russia through pressure rather than through kind of a friendly offer to talk will be able to maybe come to the table and offer terms that Ukraine can accept.
But just on the point of dialogue, Nick, I wonder if I can press you on this. Let's assume that next week you have Donald Trump winning the presidency, and then the United States starts, lessening its support for Ukraine, and then the onus then falls on the Europeans. Could there be a scenario in which the Europeans say, hey, maybe it's time that you start talking to Russia and start talking about some sort of a peace plan, because we will not be able to single-handedly support you for longer?
I mean, we don't know. We can't second guess, right, what they will do if. I think that, for now, lots of these projections have been based on a hope that, the Trump presidency wouldn't happen and that this would just be a kind of, a kind of scare that people will be able to get over and forget. I think, we have heard that certain European governments are preparing and have been kind of stockpiling supplies in preparation for kind of a Trump win and the need to then kind of replace American support. So apparently there has been some contingency planning in Europe there to help Ukraine and to kind of fill that gap that could be left by American kind of withdrawal of support. But there's also a question of leverage, right? If American support basically starts dwindling, what leverage do they then have to tell the Ukrainians to stop fighting? Maybe there will be some period where Ukraine tries to carry on as best it can without that support. We can't know. But I mean, for now, there isn't a mood in Kyiv to, among ordinary Ukrainians, as tired as they are, and most people obviously want this war to be over yesterday. But when you ask them, are you willing to just go and kind of, freeze this conflict like that you did in 2014? They say that will give the West an excuse to disengage, to stop paying attention to us. And, Vladimir Putin will take a year or two, especially if the sanctions are loosened, to rebuild his army, and he'll come back and finish the job. And next time around, we won't be able to defend Kyiv. So that is the kind of prevailing mood here.
And we'll leave it at that mood. Nick, thanks so much for joining us and making the time. It's always busy in Kyiv, we are aware. Thanks so much. Great talking to you today.
Thanks, Nick.
Great.
And that's
another sobering
Nick,
conversation.
It's always sobering talking to Nick, because he just tells you what the Ukrainians are thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's why I was curious to know what is being said. I think the dialogue question is going to come up in this next administration. That's my feeling as well. Yesterday I had a very interesting conversation as well with Alexander Vindman, former Army Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army. He was actually the director for European Affairs for the U.S. National Security during the Trump administration. And I asked him about this topic, of course, of Ukraine and the situation in Europe and how things could change. It was pretty terrifying conversation, I'm going to say, I had with him, because essentially what he was saying was that Europe, and we've been talking about this throughout the show today, is that, Europe needs to step up and really increase spending and really sort of change their approach to defence and defence here on the continent. which seems to be the direction that we're headed anyway. But he sort of gave us this very, very terrifying, I would say, prediction of what could happen under a possible Donald Trump presidency. So that's, I think, on our YouTube channel. You can check it out, Alexandra Vintman.
Oh, that'll be interesting to check out. I think we want to sort of bring a part of that into this, but then somehow never got around to doing it in the thrust and
so many things that we could bring in.
Yeah, let's bring in some results. That's something that we can bring in, and that's something that Cherie can help us with on the poll question that we had asked about an hour back or longer.
Yeah, okay. Our poll question is, where will the US election impact Europe most? We've got 349 votes. Actually, the result is quite tight. So 33% of votes go to the NATO alliance and 32% goes to assistance to Ukraine. Another 20% goes to trade policies and 13% goes to diplomatic relations.
I mean, that's along expected lines, right? I mean, security and NATO,
absolutely,
generally the cornerstone of the US and the EU relationship, which is why the trade thing was so important. I'm glad that you brought that context in, Jared.
Yeah, it is. Let's see what happens to this 1.5 trillion euros, dollars each year, given what Alexandra had to say a bit earlier.
And given that a particular candidate loves the word tariffs because it's such a beautiful word.
It's the most beautiful word. I think Alexandra as well, what Alexandra was saying is, you know, the European Union is a fascinating, I'm not someone who would say that, but it is actually a fascinating mix, of course, of countries with, you know, and we're in this quite, I suppose, new era where we're seeing the growth of these populist parties, the growth of the far right. I think it was with a very different vision for Europe. And I think how we're going to see that play out in the next few years, and the relationship with the US, of course, and depending on who's in office, is you know, that could determine the future of this bloc going in the next, maybe in the near future.
Not just from within the bloc. You talk about a new era and different visions. There are different visions that are being articulated around the world as well. Or one of, particularly from countries in the global south. I mean, I don't like using that term, but it's something that is generally used in analytical terms, so let's just use it so people know what we're talking about. There is a definitive movement and a definitive articulation, particularly from countries such as India and South Africa and other BRICS nations, for example, who talk about a multipolar world, who talk about not one set of nations determining the rules for the rest, but everybody contributing and having their say. So it's interesting times, and it may not be just about candidate Trump changing everything. It's just the flow of times is slightly different. It just matters to see where we end up.
Absolutely.
But I think it's a moving target.
And there's one thing that I do want to mention, which I haven't mentioned so far, which is, of course, we're talking about the presidency, but we also cannot forget that, you know, Congress is a huge part of this. And, you know, we saw the difficulties that Joe Biden had in getting, you know, the aid package for Ukraine through. So that's also going to be a factor in these elections next week because, of course, you know, that it's not just a presidential election. We're also going to have elections in Congress. And that could mean that we could see a shift in who's actually in charge there. And depending on who wins and who's in charge, well, of course, that's going to impact the relationship with Europe and also, I think, particularly with Ukraine.
Deadlock isn't a word that goes well with trade policy
Absolutely
or security policy,
No,
particularly, especially when the war is on. That's about it for today. Thanks so much for you guys for sending in your comments, questions, and interesting observations. We love receiving them. Thanks to everybody around the table. Jared, thanks for bringing up those graphics. Cherie, thanks for talking to everybody in the chat and bringing their questions to you, Pablo. Pablo, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Biresh. It's been awesome being a part of this. And don't forget, of course, that you can keep commenting. This show will be up on DW's YouTube channel. So keep the chat going.
And remember, we'll be back again next week, and we shall have the topic, the theme up 24 hours in advance, so you can start commenting then. That's next week. Thank you for this week. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.